Good afternoon. I'm Douglas Frey. I'm a Special Assistant County Attorney at the Harris County Attorney's Office. For the last 13 years, I've been working with the County Attorney's Office on issues pertaining to election law. I advise the county clerk and the tax assessor collector on voter registration and the conducting of elections. It's been a very interesting 13 years, and I can tell you that this election has been described as being the most important election in our lifetimes. Well, I have a pretty long lifetime, and I can remember when Kennedy was running against Nixon, but I concur in that. I think that we are in a period of time in which many and very important decisions are going to be made, and they're going to be made at the ballot box. So let's dive right in. The first thing I'd like to tell you about is the resources that are available to you. The county clerk maintains a webpage called harrisvotes.com, if you'll put up the number 2 slide there. And what that information what information is available to you on that page is such things as information about ballot by mail, information about where your polling locations are, information about what will be on your ballot. So if you are interested in knowing what is going to be on your ballot, and this is going to be a very long ballot, most of the people in Harris County will have at least 60 decisions to make when they go to the polls. You can go to that page, and under the tab that says sample ballot, you can click on it and you can pull up a box which you can fill in your name, and it'll show you the ballot that is particular for you, showing all of the particular races, the districts for state representative or state senator that are particular to you. And you can print that off if you want to and take that with you to the polling place, and you can be prepared to vote. And this is particularly important in this election because for the first time in a general election in Texas, we will not have straight ticket voting. You can't just check the Republican box or the Democratic box and have that automatically fill in all the candidates with that party. You're going to have to go through and individually check each box for each candidate. If you want all the Democrats, you're going to have to go through and check all the Democrats. If you want all the Republicans, you're going to have to go through and check all the Republicans. So that's one thing. The next thing that you have to be cognizant of is that there are many issues involved in voting. And I'm going to try and talk to them a little bit. Why don't you go to the number 3 slide there? These are the subjects I'm generally going to try and touch on during this conversation. The powers and duties of election judges, countywide polling places, poll watchers, bystanders, electioneering, aiding and instructing voters and interpreters, electronic devices, handguns, qualifying the voters, that's voter identification, and provisional ballots and ballot by mail. A lot of this has been in the news lately. I'll talk more about that later. And we need to cover a lot of these subjects so that you'll be able to advise your clients if they have questions about any of these things, about what is the right thing to do. Now, election law is a subject that's very vast. It's like saying, okay, let's have a seminar about wills. Well, that's a lot of talk about a lot of stuff. There are particular subjects in that may or may not be more important to folks depending on their period of life. Same thing is true in elections. Election law is very vast, and I'm going to talk about what is concerned basically for the voter when they go to the polling place. First of all, what are the powers and duties of an election judge? An election judge is, the code says that an election judge has the power of a district court judge. For all you lawyers out there, just imagine that. A person who is recruited basically as a volunteer, they are paid $17 an hour, so they're not strictly a volunteer, but they work just elections, and they're put in charge of a polling place, and they're told that they can make any ruling necessary in order to keep the peace or any ruling necessary in order for people to vote. So that's a great deal of power. Another thing election judge does is they set the limits where you can electioneer. They actually measure the distance from the door to the electioneering limit. They are in charge of keeping the peace inside that 100-foot limit. So that's a lot of responsibility. And I can tell you from my experience, it's not always executed exactly the way it should in a smooth manner. So the we're in luck though. Starting in 2018, since 2018, starting in 2019, we've adopted in Harris County the countywide polling place system. What that means is many of you are used to going and voting early. You know that there are a certain number of early voting sites, and you're allowed to go to any one of them. So you walk into the polling place at the Metropolitan Service Center, they can show you the ballot that's particular to you, even if you live in Tomball. The same is true at all the early voting sites. Now, on Election Day, there'll be over 800 different polling places, and each and every one of them will be a countywide polling place. So you can go to any one that's convenient to you. The one that's near your home, the one that's near your work, the one that's near your school, wherever is most convenient to you, you can go to that polling place and they'll be able to pull up the ballot that is particular to you. Let's move on and put up the slide for poll watching activity. Poll watchers are folks that are appointed by either a candidate or a party to stand around the polls and watch what happens. It basically works on the same theory as your teenage kid. As long as you're not watching what they're doing, who knows what they're up to? But if you have your eye on them, they're a lot better behaved. So a poll watcher can be appointed and has to actually present their documentation that they've been appointed by either a candidate or a party to the election judge on Election Day. That designation has to show who appointed them, what place they're appointed to watch, and during what period of time they're allowed to watch. What they're allowed to watch is the early voting poll activity, including before and after the locations open, the Election Day precinct polling activity, including before and after the polling location opens and after it closes, the early voting ballot board meetings. The early voting ballot board is an interesting group. Basically, they're political appointees. They're appointed by the Election Commission of Harris County, and they have a kind of a quasi-judicial role. It is their job to look at all of the mail-in ballots and all of the provisional ballots and make a ruling as to whether those ballots will be counted or not. So they have a tremendous, important job. The poll watchers, skip back to that, they can watch the central counting station where they actually conduct the counting of the votes. It's a lot less exciting than you think. Basically, there's a bunch of computer nerds feeding, computer chips into computers and then doing something with a program spitting out a report. They can observe a voter who is being assisted by an election official in the polling place. They can inspect and secure the breaking out and securing of voting equipment. They can even observe the delivery of election results from a polling place to the drop-off point for central count. Now, basically what that entails is that the voting machines that compile the results are loaded into a lockbox and driven from the polling place to the drop-off place where it is extracted. But that whole process of locking the machine up at the polling place, driving over to the drop-off point and unloading the equipment, the poll watcher is allowed to do that. In fact, the election code is very specific that you have to either allow them to accompany in your own car or to drive in such a way that they can keep up with you so they can keep an eye on you the whole time. So we are actually expecting to have quite a few poll watchers during this particular election. Now, what are poll watchers allowed to do and not allowed to do? One thing that they're not allowed to do is communicate with the voter in any way. They can't speak to them. They can't make signs to them. They can't wink at them. They can't frown at them. They can't do anything that communicates with the voters in any way. They cannot interfere with the voters in any way. What they can do is they can stand or sit in a place that allows them to observe all of the polling activities. And if they have any problems that they observe, any violations of the law or any violations of election procedures, they are allowed to go to the election worker and tell them what the problem is. The election worker does not have to discuss it with them. They can direct them to go to the election judge. the election judge can listen to the complaint, and if they want to, they can engage in a conversation with the poll watcher. Mostly what poll watchers are there for is to be witnesses. If something goes wrong, they can at a later time basically testify to those problems. Poll watchers quite often cause problems because they take it upon themselves to go beyond those limits, to actually try to insist that things be done differently in a way that's, amenable to them, rather than allow the poll workers to do their jobs. So they are allowed to watch, as I said, the activity of the assistance that an election worker gives to a voter. Now, if somebody else who's not an election worker is assisting the voter, they're not allowed to observe that. That's allowed to be done in private. Okay, let's take that slide down and let's go on to the next subject. The next subject has to do with bystanders and electioneering. Bystanders are generally prohibited in a polling place. You're not allowed to loiter around a polling place and just hang out there. You can if you're actually appointed to be a poll watcher and admitted to watch, but you cannot if you're not. If you want to electioneer, which is defined as advocating the election or non-election of any particular candidate or provision that's on the ballot, you have to do that beyond a marker that's supposed to be set 100 feet from the entrance to the polling place. So the election judge will go out and measure 100 feet from the door and put a little sign there that says no electioneering within this limit. And if you want to electioneer, which is typically handing out material to people who are coming to vote, you have to do so beyond that line. Now, even beyond that line, you're not allowed to affect a disturbance of the peace. And quite often, the complaints that we get in our office have to do with people who are exceeding that particular provision. They're blocking traffic, they're causing a bunch of noise, and we have to go and deal with that. Our office, the county attorney's office, actually has teams of people who are charged with actually going to polling places to help the election judge perform their duties. But one of the things that we're called upon quite often is to deal with folks who are electioneering in a way that is interfering with the voters in some way. And we try to calm things down, make sure everybody understands the rules, and allow them to exercise their constitutional rights to try to persuade people to vote the way that they want them to vote, but at the same time, not intimidate or interfere with the voters. So that can be difficult for some people. Some of them get very enthusiastic about their work. Now, if somebody comes up to a voter, is electioneering, and hands them some written material, that voter may discard it, or they may take it with them into the polling place and use it to help them vote. There's no prohibition against carrying any kind of paper material into the polling place by the voter in order to aid them in voting. So that's why I urge you to print off your ballot and fill it out ahead of time so that you spend a minimum amount of time at the polling booth while you're trying to fill out your electronic ballot. Let's talk about aiding the voters right now. Aiding and instructing voters. A voter is entitled to ask for assistance. Now, the code says it's supposed to be if you have trouble reading or understanding the ballot, but the truth is that federal law does not allow us to question whether or not the voter needs assistance. So if a voter comes up to the polling place and says, I need assistance, they can either ask one of the poll workers to assist them in filling out their ballot, or they can bring another person of their own choice. There's only two limitations on who that other person can be. That other person cannot be their boss, and it cannot be their union rep. Other than that, it can be anybody that can help them understand and render their ballot perfectly. Let's give some examples. Let's say that there's somebody who is language challenged, and they bring their 10-year-old son with them. He can speak English, and he can speak the language that the mother can speak, and she wants the 10-year-old son to come and translate the ballot for her and help her fill it out. That is perfectly okay. It doesn't have to be a registered voter. It doesn't have to be somebody who's old enough to vote. It can be anybody that the voter chooses to aid them, as long as it's not their employer or their union rep. So that person, when they are brought into the polling place, is required to recite a short oath, swearing that they'll make sure that the ballot is filled out the way the voter wants it. There's a different oath if the assistance that the voter wants is a translation. So if the voter does not speak English and they bring somebody with them that can speak English and translate for them, then that person has a different oath, which says that they promise to accurately translate all communication for the voter. Once that's done, then that person can go to the voting booth and help that person vote. Now, in Texas, we are required to render all election material and all election services in both English and Spanish. Harris County, under federal law, is also required to render all that assistance in Vietnamese and Chinese. So we have people either at each polling place or available to translate from English to Spanish, English to Vietnamese, English to Chinese. There's a myriad of other languages. We do not provide by law assistance in each one of those languages, but we do have people available that we've recruited in some of the other more popular languages, like Korean, for example. So that if a voter comes into a polling place and says that they want assistance in one of these languages, we do have people that can assist them. These people are employees of the county voting system, and they will render that assistance. One thing about poll watchers, if a poll watcher sees that assistance is being rendered by translating from English to one of these languages by a poll worker, they're allowed to insist that a translation into English of everything that's being said be repeated to the poll watcher. If that assistance, however, is being rendered by a person of their choosing who's not an employee of the poll, who's not a poll worker, then they are not entitled to that translation. So there's a distinction between whether or not the person rendering assistance is a poll worker or not a poll worker. Beyond that, it could be anybody who could render the assistance. One question that we get quite often is there'll be representatives of candidates outside offering to render assistance. Sometimes the candidate himself will be outside and offer to render assistance. This is perfectly okay as long as it is the voter who says they want assistance from this person. And the same person can stand outside and render assistance over and over again to voter after voter. There's no limit on how many times a person can render assistance to a voter. And some people question whether that's a wise system, but it is permissible under the law. Okay, let's talk about electronic devices. One of the reasons why that I told you that you should print out your ballot and take your paper ballot with you is that electronic devices are prohibited in the polling place. We have become very dependent upon our electronic devices. Our average cell phone does a lot of things. It can record video, it can record sound, it can take pictures, it can communicate electronically with other people. That is prohibited in the polling place. So some places will actually tell you have to turn off your phones when you walk in. Other places will merely instruct you that you cannot use them while you're there. If you do not obey this command, not to use it or turn it off, the polling judge can actually eject you from the polling place. So do yourself a favor. Put the cell phones aside and print out the paper and carry the paper with you into the polling place. You'll see lots of stuff on the internet where people go and vote and they take a picture of their ballot and say, look at me, I voted. That's prohibited under the law. You cannot take a picture. You cannot record either sound or video inside a polling place You cannot communicate using an electronic device while you're in a polling place. Just keep all that in mind. You can't go up there and save on your phone the list of people that you want to vote for, because once you pull that out, the election workers will come around and tell you you have to turn your device off, and you won't be able to use it in order to fill out your ballot. So be very careful when you come into the polling place. Have the paper document with you. Use it. Turn off your device, and don't take any of those I voted selfies. Post them online. I think that the reason why that this particular law is in effect is because they believe that there are people who are under duress, and they are required by their employer to vote a certain way and take a picture to prove that they voted a certain way, or they will lose their jobs. At least that's the kind of theory that I've heard spoken of. Or there may be people in an abusive relationship, and one of them requires the other one to vote in a certain way and document proof of that. So the ballot that you cast, you are entitled to do so confidentially. And that confidentiality, you may decide you don't need it, but the law actually enforces it in this particular way. Okay, the next subject I'd like to talk about is handguns. I wish I didn't have to talk about this, but there are many people in Texas. I think that about 7% of the population has licenses to carry handguns, and it permits them to carry it in a concealed manner. One of the exceptions of the places where people who are licensed handgun carriers can carry a handgun is into a polling place. So if you have a handgun and you ordinarily carry it, make sure that you secure it outside before you go inside to vote, because it is still a crime for you to carry that handgun into a polling place, even if you are a licensed carrier. Now, recently, the Attorney General has issued an opinion that says that the election judge is an exception. There is an exception under the law that allows judges to carry handguns to places where it is otherwise prohibited. And although I personally disagree with the analysis that the Attorney General has made as to whether an election judge fits within that description, that opinion does exist. So it is possible that there will be election judges who are actually carrying handguns while they're working, and they're doing so legally. But that does not entitle anybody else. None of the other election workers, and certainly none of the voters or the poll watchers, to be armed while they're inside the polling place. I wish I didn't have to bring that up, but this is Texas, and people do ask that question. They really, really want to know the answer to that one. Okay, let's go on to qualifying the voter. When you go in to vote, what you'll need to do is you'll have to identify yourself and produce identification. Now, the electronic poll book that they'll pull your information up from has a reader in it that can read that the barcode that's on the back of your driver's license. We are in a situation right now where we are taking lots of precautions because of the pandemic. If you go into the polling place to vote in person, what you'll encounter is all of the poll workers will be wearing masks and these visor things on them. They'll be wearing gloves. There'll be a plexiglass shield between you and them. They will have a slot where they'll ask you to put your driver's license into, and that slot will allow the machine to read the barcode. And once it pulls the information up for you to verify, you can take your driver's license back. Nobody that's working there will even have to touch the thing. What forms of identification are actually permitted in Texas in order to prove your identification? There's a two-step method. If you have one of the acceptable methods of identification, and I always say there are 7 of them. There's a list there. This is the statute. This is reproduction of the statute, the section of the statute, 63.0101. This is the documentation of proof of identification that the statute permits. And actually, subsection 1, I think, actually has 3 different types. That's why I always say there are 7. But there are always 7 types of identification that are permissible. You can use a driver's license, what's known as an election identification certificate or a personal identification card that's been issued by the Department of Public Safety. It cannot be expired more than 4 years before the date that you present it to vote. You can use a military identification card. You can use a citizenship certificate that has your picture on it. You can use a United States passport, and that includes the little card that they give you if you have one of those cards. You can use a license to carry a concealed handgun. Yes, you can actually use that as identification to vote. It's actually issued by DPS just the same as your driver's license and has the same indicia of reliability that a driver's license has, so it's acceptable under the law. If you have one of these forms of identification, that's sufficient. They'll allow you to qualify to vote using one of those forms of identification. If you're 70 years or older, you can produce one of these types of identification. It doesn't matter how long it's been expired. So if you're 71 and you have a driver's license that expired back in 1982, that is still sufficient identification to be able to vote. But if you have a regular driver's license, it can be expired 4 years from the day that you're trying to vote. So if you're trying to vote today, for example, October the 1st, as long as it was still good on October 1st of 2016, that is sufficient identification. An election identification certificate is a special type of identification that can be obtained through DPS, which doesn't require you to pass a driver's test or do many of the other things that you would have to do in order to get a driver's license. It's basically designed for people of limited means. It's free, and you can use it for voting. There's very few of these that have actually been issued, but it is an option that's available to people and was put into the law because of complaints that people would have a hard time actually obtaining a driver's license or a personal identification card. The United States military issues a wide variety of identifications. It's not just the standard Department of Defense identification card, but you can use a Veterans Administration card or many other types of identification that the military issues. The United States Citizenship Certificate, a lot of people say mine doesn't have a photo on it. If it does have a photo, it qualifies in this particular way. And why don't you go ahead and put up the next slide, slide number 6. If you don't have one of those forms of identification, you can sign a short affidavit saying, I am the voter who's offering to vote. I do not have one of those other forms of identification, but I do have, and I can produce an alternative form of identification. This certificate is called a reasonable impediment declaration. Poll workers refer to this as a RID. If you don't have one of those forms of identification, you still want to vote, and you can produce one of the alternative forms of identification that are shown on this list. That's a government document that shows the name and address of the voter, including the voter's registration certificate. That's the certificate that the tax assessor sends you when you register to vote. A government document that shows your name and address might be something as simple as a letter that somebody like, say, myself has sent to you, addressed to you, your name and address. You can say, this is a government document. It's a letter from the county attorney's office. It has my name and address on it. I am offering this as an alternative form of identification. And many people get things like tax bills. It has their name, it has their address. It's a government document that can be used in support of a reasonable impediment declaration. You can use the original or copy of a current utility bill. A current utility bill, according to the Secretary of State's office, is one that's at least not less than 4 months old. You can use an original or copy of a bank statement, which shows the voter's name and address. Once again, this can't be more than 4 months old. You can use the original or a copy of a government check that shows the voter's name and address. I don't know if most government checks show that, but the checks that the IRS sends out as refunds do have the address of the voter on them. You can produce that as the form of identification that supports a reasonable impediment declaration. You can use the original or a copy of a paycheck which shows the voter's name and address. That is anybody's paycheck. So if you're working down at the corner drugstore and they issue you a paycheck and it has your name and address on it, you can produce that or a copy of that in support of the reasonable impediment declaration. And finally, a certified copy of a domestic birth certificate or other document confirming your birth as admissible in a court of law and establishes your identity. So those things would be produced in addition to filling out and executing the reasonable impediment declaration. The declaration will note what type of identification was produced in support of it. If you are able to produce one of these alternative forms of identification, and you fill out and sign the reasonable impediment declaration, which is basically under penalty of perjury if you include any kind of false information, you can vote a regular ballot. So you can either produce one of the 7 types of identification, go ahead and vote, or you can fill out the RID, produce one of these alternate forms of identification, go ahead and vote regular ballot. If you don't have any of these things, your alternative is to do a provisional ballot. A provisional ballot is a ballot that you can fill out, which states basically that you claim to be a qualified voter. However, the election documents that the people qualifying you to vote have examined fail to establish it. You can cast one of these if you say, I'm registered to vote here, and they pull up on the e-poll book and it doesn't show your name as being a registered voter. You can say, I want to vote a provisional ballot. If you don't have identification, even if your name is on the list of registered voters, you don't have any form of identification, you can vote a provisional ballot. So a provisional ballot is a very interesting process. You fill it out, you put it in an envelope, you fill out an affidavit stating the basis upon which you claim that you're a registered voter, even though you're not showing up on the registration list or that you don't have identification, and that is submitted to the early voting ballot board. Now, the early voting ballot board will check to see if you have produced identification at any of the tax assessor collector's branch offices within 6 days after the election. If you do appear and show one of the original 7 types of identification, and that record is transmitted to the early voting ballot board within 6 days of the election, that provisional ballot will count. If you fail to show identification, that will not cure that ballot. They will not count it. The only time that you can cure a provisional ballot by showing identification is in that situation when you fail to prove that you fail to produce any type of identification when you went to vote. Every other reason that you may have executed a provisional ballot instead, there is no cure that you have to undertake in order to make sure that vote counts. Once it gets to the early voting ballot board, what they'll do is they'll investigate your claim. So if you say, I am a registered voter, but I didn't show up on the registration list, they will check the registrar's office to see what your history is of registering to vote. There's a common problem in that people will go to the DPS office, believe that they've updated their registration information so that they were registered to vote, and that information has not been communicated through the system and gotten into the e-poll book. If they discover, in fact, that you did fill out the proper registration material at DPS, but it wasn't processed properly, they'll go ahead and update that information and count that provisional ballot. There's a myriad of other reasons people may have that can be discovered to be accurate that will allow the provisional ballots to be counted. But for the most part, that is a process that the early voting ballot board will go through. One of the main benefits that we got from going to the countywide polling place system is that we no longer have to worry about reviewing ballots by people that voted in the wrong precinct. People will show up in the wrong precinct and say, I'm entitled to vote here. And instead of going to the right precinct, they'll insist on getting a provisional ballot. That is not something we have to worry about. And I would say 80% of the provisional ballots that were cast, that was the situation. Since we now can do countywide polling and you can go to any polling place and vote anywhere that you want, that is no longer an objection that will prevent you from being able to cast a regular ballot. So there's no provisional ballots, a lot less provisional ballots for the early voting ballot board to review, and a lot more people whose votes will count. So let's finally talk about ballot by mail. Ballot by mail is a very interesting process. Ballot by mail in Texas is limited. In some states, they actually mail a ballot to every registered voter. You don't even have to ask. There's 5 states where that's true, states like Utah and Oregon. California doesn't have that system, but because of the pandemic, they decided to go to it for this election. So if you're registered to vote, you receive a ballot by mail, which you then fill out and mail back. In Texas, there's a limitation. We're one of 5 states where there is a limitation on who can ask for a ballot by mail. In order to be eligible to vote by mail in Texas, you must be 65 or over, disabled, intending to be out of the county during the entire election period, or confined in jail but otherwise qualified to vote. If you're 65 or over, that's pretty easy to determine. If you know you're going to be out of the county during the election period, that is also pretty easy to determine. If you know you're in jail but otherwise qualified to vote and you want to vote, that's pretty easy. All the controversy that you may have heard about in the media has to do with the question of who is disabled. Under Texas law, we do not follow a strict evaluation of who's disabled as far as ballot by mail is concerned. It's found in section 82.002 of the election code. And what it says is that you are disabled if you are sick, or if you have a physical condition which it is likely to require either assistance or that it might injure your health if you were to vote in person. The statute does say that if you're pregnant, that qualifies as a disability as far as being eligible to vote by mail is concerned. So the question became, okay, what if I don't have COVID and I'm not immune to COVID, but I want to vote, and I'm afraid that if I go down there in person, that I might catch COVID? Is that enough reason to say that I'm disabled? This case went all the way to the Texas Supreme Court. And what the Texas Supreme Court said was, it's an in re state is the name of the case. What the Supreme Court said was that lack of immunity to COVID by itself is not enough to qualify you as being a person entitled to vote by mail. However, it is a factor that can be considered by a person in evaluating their overall health in deciding whether or not it fits and that they're eligible. So a person may have many other underlying conditions, heart disease, asthma, COPD, cancer, diabetes, and combined with the fact that those people that have these underlying conditions are much more likely to have adverse health problems if they were to catch COVID, they could decide that they were disabled under this eligibility. The Supreme Court also said 2 other things that were very interesting. One is they said that under the present system, it is up to the voter to make this determination, up to the voter to determine whether they are eligible under the disability qualification. So it's up to you as a voter to say, I know what my health is. I think that this is a risk to go actually to vote in person. Therefore, I will claim disability. And they also said one other thing, and that is that the election official who receives an application which claims a disability has neither the ability nor the authority to question that claim of disability. So if the county clerk's office received an application from somebody and the basis for eligibility that they claimed is disabled, they send them a ballot by mail. They don't question that. They don't require any further proof. They don't require any further explanation. In order to vote by mail, what you have to do is you have to obtain an application. You have to fill out the application, which indicates your name and your address and the basis upon which you are eligible to vote. It must indicate which elections you want to vote by mail. If you're 65 or over disabled, you can indicate that you want it for all elections that year. And you send it to the voter administrator, the county clerk in Harris County. That voter administrator reviews the application to see if you have properly claimed a basis for eligibility. And there are 4 boxes on the application form that is the standard form: 65 or over, disabled, intends to be out of the county, or confined to jail. If you have checked one of these boxes, they will send you a ballot by mail. A ballot by mail is sent to each person who's asked for one in an application. The application requires that the voter sign it. The ballot, once it is sent to the voter then fills out the ballot, puts it in the carrier envelope, and signs the carrier envelope and mails that back. One of the things that the Early Voting Ballot Board does is it has what's known as a signature verification committee. They look at the 2 signatures. And if there's any question, they can look at any signature that the voter registrar or the county clerk has on file going back 6 years to make sure that the person who asked for the ballot and the person who sent the ballot in is actually the registered voter who's entitled to vote by mail. Once they have approved the signatures, they've determined that they've matched, they'll put that ballot into the pile to be counted. If they have some question about it, if there's some defect in the way that the ballot by mail is submitted, the law requires that we contact the voter and give them an opportunity to cure that defect. So if there's no signature, we contact the voter and say, you have to come down here and sign this ballot, or you have to provide some way for us to have a signature on this carrier so that we can compare your signature. So that has to be given to the voter, an opportunity to cure any kind of defect in the ballot process. Now, one of the main reasons why ballots by mail are not counted is that we don't get them in time. We must receive the application for ballot by mail by October 23rd. October 23rd this year, 11 days before Election Day. We must receive the ballot by mail. It must be postmarked by Election Day. That's November 3rd this year. And it must be received by the clerk by the close of business the day after Election Day. That is November the 4th. If we receive it November 5th, even if it's postmarked by November 3rd, it won't be counted. In July, during the runoff, there was about 2,000 ballots that came in late, and we weren't able to use them. We weren't able to count them. They were too late. And the same thing is going to be true in this election. If we receive them after the close of business on November the 4th, they won't be counted. There is an exception, and that is overseas ballots. Ballots that are being sent by people that qualify to vote from overseas, our soldiers and such. We can receive those up to 6 days after the election. So we can receive them all the way up through the 9th of November, and they'll be counted. So there will be a time period after Election Day where ballot by mail, we can receive them, we can process them, we can count them. So the actual results that are announced on Election Day are not the official results. One advantage that Texas has over many of the other jurisdictions you may have heard is that we are allowed to open up and start processing these signatures 20 days before the election. So we're going to start 3 weeks early to actually process all the ballots. We should be able to review and process and make our decisions on which ballots are valid ballots and correct all the problems by Election Day and count them on Election Day. And so that we will be able to announce at the close of the polls on Election Day what the ballot by mail total is going to be. Now, we have received over 200,000 applications for ballot by mail, which is about 50% more than we've ever received for any election before. And we, as I mentioned earlier, we have until October the 23rd in order to receive those applications. Now, you may have also heard about the litigation that's going on over the application for ballot by mail. Essentially, what has happened is this. The clerk's office decided, because of the pandemic, that it would be a good idea to send out an application, not a ballot, but an application for ballot by mail to all registered voters in Harris County. We sent one to all registered voters over the age of 65 for the July runoff, but it worked so well, we decided it would be a good idea to expand it. Before this could be done, after it was announced it was going to be done, the state stepped in. The Attorney General's office filed a motion in district court in Harris County, in the 127 District Court, asking the court to enter an injunction saying that it was illegal for us to send a ballot by mail to anybody who didn't ask for it, unless they're 65 and over. And it's okay with them because, after all, that we know that they're qualified to vote. But if we send one to everybody else, not all of them will be eligible to use it. So even if there are strict instructions over who's eligible to use it, warning the people that it would be improper to use it if they weren't eligible, it would be improper to send it to everybody, because there might be somebody out there who would receive it and be fooled into thinking that maybe they would be entitled to use it even though they weren't. So the trial court ruled that the Attorney General was not entitled to an injunction, that there was nothing in the law, that we were charged as the early voting clerk. The county clerk was charged as the early voting clerk to conduct ballot by mail, that he was required under the law to make all forms necessary for ballot by mail readily and timely available to the voters. And that was within his discretion to send it out or make it available in any way he thought best, and that this way was not prohibited by the law. The Attorney General basically hung his hat on a provision that said that if somebody asked us for the form, we had to mail it to them. So there's nothing in there that prohibited us from providing it to anybody in any other way. And we have it on our webpage under harrisvotes.com. You may remember I showed you the webpage back at the beginning. Under voting by mail, there's a link from which you can actually download this form that I'm talking about, the application for ballot by mail form. And there's nothing else in the law that says we can't provide it to anybody else in any other way. In fact, any group, any individual can get that form and send it to anybody that they want to in order to urge them to vote by mail. And most of the parties, the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, do exactly that. They get a ballot by mail form and send it to all the voters that they are urging to vote by mail, and do so on a very regular basis. So at any rate, to get back to the main story, the Court of Appeals also agreed that the Attorney General was not entitled to an injunction. So the Attorney General has gone to the Supreme Court, and as I'm recording this, an argument is being made before the Supreme Court as to whether a mandamus should be entered to block the county clerk from sending an application for voter by mail to all eligible voters, all registered voters in Harris County. So possibly by the time this recording is shown to you on Thursday afternoon, some decision will be made, possibly not. But we're hoping for a quick decision so that we can actually get the applications in the mail as soon enough so that it'll do some good. Because as I reiterated a minute ago, you have to return that application for ballot by mail by the 23rd of October. Now, you can return a ballot by mail application by either personally delivering it to the office of the county clerk. You can do that all the way until the beginning of the period of early voting, which begins this year on October 13th. So you have to deliver it by the close of business on the 12th, or you can mail it back, or you can send it by common carrier. A common carrier is a group like FedEx. It's a company that you pay to deliver things. Once you get your ballot by mail, you can also either mail that back, or you can send it by common carrier to the clerk's office, or you can deliver it in person. You have to deliver it in person to the clerk's office. Now, luckily, the clerk has more than one office. They're spread all over town. There's 12 different locations that you can deliver the ballot by mail to if you want. The main one is going to be at Energy Arena next to the Astrodome. That's where the central count is going to be conducted this year. You have to drop it off in person. You can't have somebody else deliver it. And when you do drop off your ballot by mail, you have to show an identification. So you have to do it in person and show an identification. But other than that, you can go to any of the branch offices of the county clerk. And the locations for drop off are listed on harrisvotes.com. I think that I have covered a lot of territory here. I appreciate the chance to talk to everybody about election law. And like I said, there's lots of different subjects that are included in election law that I'm not talking about. And I'm mainly concentrating on areas that people have a specific interest in, who are our voters, who want to vote in the November election. And I'm really hoping that you take your time. As I've described before, there'll be elections for president. There's an election for senator, for U.S. representative, and everybody will be voting in all of those elections. There are elections for members of the Texas Supreme Court. There's actually 4 members of the Supreme Court up for re-election. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, there's 3 people on that court are up for election. There's a member of the Railroad Commission that's up for an unexpired term. The Courts of Appeal, the 14th and the 1st, have people that are up for election. And then there's all the county offices. There are 24 different district court judges in Harris County that are up for election during this particular period. There are 3 or 4 different county court at law judges that are going to be up for election. There are state representatives and state senators. So some of you may live in districts where somebody is opposed, and actually the decision has to be rendered as to who to vote for. State senators, you may be in a state senator district where your state senator is up. That's going to be on the ballot. Then there's the justices of the peace. 8 justices of the peace and 8 constables are on the ballot. Some of them opposed, some of them not. 2 county commissioners races are on the ballot. I think if you live in precinct 1, that's unopposed, Commissioner Ellis. If you live in precinct 3, however, there is a Democrat and a Republican running in that particular precinct. That's generally the west side of Houston. So these are all things that are going to be on the ballot. One other thing that you have to know about is that back in May, there were many small school districts and cities that are in Harris County that were going to conduct an election. Emergency service districts, lots of small type districts who had to cancel their election because of the pandemic. And what they're doing is they're coming back now in November and conducting those elections now. Ordinarily, those people would not be on the ballot at this time, but they will be on the ballot because their election in May was canceled. So many of you will live in these small districts. City of Baytown, for example, is going to be on there. School districts are going to be on there. They will have people on the ballot that you'll have to vote for as well. So this ballot, like I said, is going to be a long ballot. People will not be able to do straight party ticket voting. We expect people to take a lot more time in the polling place, actually voting because of the lack of straight ticket voting. Anyways, so I advise you to vote early or to vote by mail. The early voting period was extended. It is now begins on October 13th and runs through October 30th. You'll be able to vote every day during that period. During the week, you can vote from 7 in the morning till 7 at night. There are 120 different polling places that'll be open. There'll be 11 different locations where you can do what's known as drive-through voting. It'll be kind of like going to Sonic. You'll just pull up to the polling place, stay in your car. They'll bring the election machine to your car. You'll qualify to vote and vote in your car, and then you can just drive away. You don't even have to get out of your car. You don't have to go into the polling place. There will be one at Toyota Center. There will be one at Energy Arena. There will be 11 different locations, and those locations are also available on harrisvotes.com. That's going to be, I think, a very easy way to vote. But also, in addition to that, for the last week of early voting, I think on Sundays you'll be able to vote from 12 until 7. But the last week of early voting, starting on the 28th, on the 27th, polling places will be open until 10 o'clock at night instead of 7 o'clock at night. And on the evening of the 29th, they will be open in 7 different locations all night, 24 hours in 7 different locations. These locations are also available on harrisvotes.com. You can go look and see which places you can vote in the middle of the night if you wish to. People were worried about whether security. We will have security on site to make sure all the voters are safe, all the poll workers are safe. You'll be able to go vote when it's more convenient to you, especially if you have shift works or you have clients who do shift work and they don't get off work in time to get there between 7 and 7. They'll be able to go in the evening. They'll be able to go in the middle of the night and vote at those locations. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to call the county clerk's office. Their number is 713-755-6965, and they will be able to answer your questions. Go to harrisvotes.com, examine the page. It has lots and lots of information, and you will see that there's lots of options that are available to you to make the voting experience as safe and easy. And with that, I'd kind of like to wrap it up, and we will turn to any questions that anybody has.
We are now live with Mr. Ray, taking any questions. Mr. Ray, if you want to hop on. There we go. I see you now.
Hello.
So, first question that came in. May voter, worker, watcher, or electioneer open carry a weapon inside the 100 feet inside the polling station? And I guess second part of that, if one observes such recommended actions if they see that.
Well, the quick answer is no. Even a licensed carrier is not permitted to carry a weapon inside a polling place. The only exceptions to that would be the general exception of the law. I think I actually discussed this during the seminar. The Attorney General is of the opinion that the election judge himself can carry during inside the polling place, but there's for the general member of the public that's out there that's a licensed carrier, even if you are a licensed carrier, you're not allowed to bring that weapon into a polling place. There are several locations that where it's prohibited, even if you're a licensed carrier, and a polling place is one of those.
Okay. Once they have presented qualifying ID documents, the person must also be found on the registered voter roll, correct?
Yes, the process, the way it works is you tell them, basically who you are, and they look you up on the roll. And the way that ordinarily is done is you present your identification, and that is used to find you on the voter roll. A person has to be found on the e-poll book voter roll as a registered voter before they can proceed to cast a regular ballot.
Regarding your numbered of days allowed comments, are those calendar, not Monday through Friday, quote-unquote business days, as in how soon before the November 3rd mail-in ballot board may work?
The ballot board can start work as soon as they start getting provisional ballots cast. As far as examining the signatures, they can begin work on that 20 days. Those are just calendar days before election day. So about 3 weeks before election day.
Okay. Based on the governor's orders today, how will drop-off of mail-in ballots work?
Okay, basically what the governor did today, and I discussed during the presentation that there were going to be 11 different drop-off points. Essentially what he's done is the law basically says that you can drop off only on election day. And the governor, first of all, extended that to say you could drop it off at any time prior to election day. The law itself says that this can be done at the office of the early voting ballot clerk. the early voting ballot clerk in Harris County is the county clerk, and the county clerk has 11 branch offices. So we had interpreted existing law, nothing to do with the governor's proclamation. We had interpreted existing law as meaning that any of those 11 locations could be used for drop off. Now, the governor's proclamation today specifically says that the drop off of mail in ballots can still continue before Election Day, but only at one location in each county. Harris County was not the only county that had announced they were going to have multiple locations where you could drop off mail in ballots. So, what the county clerk's office has decided they're going to do is that they were going to use the drop-off location at Energy Center, where Central Count is going to be and our main election operations are taking place. So, if you want to drop off your mail-in ballot in person, you can still do so. You can go to Energy Park, and there'll be signs directing you to the place where that drop-off can take place. And I want to caution everybody to remember that you have to deliver it in person, and at the time you drop it off, you have to present an identification. So it'd be the same procedure as when you're voting in person as far as identifying yourself. You have to appear in person, you have to show identification.
Okay. Another one regarding a ruling this week. Didn't a federal judge allow straight ticket voting in a ruling this week?
There was a federal trial court judge, I think down in Laredo, who did rule that the straight ticket voting should be allowed for people voting in person. On Monday, the Attorney General's office appealed that ruling to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals has stayed that ruling until they could consider it in a more judicious manner. So presently, that order is stayed, so there will be no straight ticket voting unless the Court of Appeals changes its mind. But it'd be a little bit difficult at this point in time to administratively change the system we have in place to allow for straight ticket voting.
Okay. And then last one that I'm seeing right now, and I'm just going to make an announcement that unless there's any more questions, this will be the last one, and then we'll do closing remarks. But have we done load testing on these 24-hour locations to make sure machines don't go down?
Yes, we one of the things that happened to us in March was, you may recall there were long lines at a couple locations, and there was delays for hours and hours after the polls closed. One of the problems we encountered was that the machines were programmed to shut off at midnight. So we have specifically undertaken to reprogram those machines so that does not happen. We'll be able to run those machines continuously during the whole night. And we took that into account and are anticipating that particular situation.
I like that change, how you guys worked around it. We, those of us with the shift working, like you said, appreciate that. I don't see any more questions, so if you have any closing remarks you'd like to make, now would be a good time for it.
This week has been just fraught with controversy. We still don't have a decision out of the Texas Supreme Court on whether or not we can send out the applications for ballot by mail to all the registered voters. I'm hoping for a smooth and non-controversial election. I don't think that hope is actually going to be fulfilled. If any of you observe any trouble, do not hesitate to contact the clerk's office or to contact the county attorney's office to report whatever problem that you're observing so that we could try to handle it. We would prefer to try to deal with situations before they get completely out of hand. And one of the things I want to advise everybody to do, if you go to a polling place and you're trying to vote and you encounter some problem, do not leave until that problem is solved. Do not leave until the supervisors are consulted, until the main office is consulted, until the attorneys are consulted, so that we can figure out what the solution is that can satisfy you so that you can exercise your right to vote.
Well, thank you very much. We really appreciate your presentation and all that you do. Thank you very much again for your presentation, and we hope all the viewers stay safe.
All right.